Hi, everyone. Hi. Good evening and welcome to Seven Stories Up. Ross Perlin with Jason Diamond, Language City, the fight to preserve endangered mother tongues in New York. We are delighted to have you all joining us tonight at the Stavros Niarchos Foundation Library. My name is Allison Nellis, and I am a supervising librarian of programming outreach here at SNFL. Before we begin, I'd like to thank the Stavros Niarchos Foundation for making programs like this evening's conversation possible. And I'd like to thank you all for coming out tonight. And I would like to encourage you to visit the New York Public Library's website and take a look at upcoming programs just like this one. We have an excellent lineup this season featuring new nonfiction, music, and more, and we would love for you to join us in this space again. And it is now my pleasure to introduce tonight's speakers. Jason Diamond is a writer and editor who lives in Brooklyn. He's the author of the memoir Searching for John Hughes, the essay collection The Sprawl, Reconsidering the Weird American Suburbs, and a co-author of the forthcoming New York Nego's Guide to New York City with Nicholas Heller. He is a contributor to GQ and New York Magazine. Since this is for a New York-centric event, he'd also like to add that he believes the best hot dog in New York City is the one you get while waiting for a pastrami sandwich online at Katz's, which is a very, very good opinion. Ross Perlin is a linguist, writer, and translator focused on exploring and supporting linguistic diversity. His book, Language City, The Fight to Preserve Endangered Mother Tongues in New York, is just out from Grove. Since 2013, he has been co-director of the Endangered Language Alliance, managing research projects on mapmaking, documentation, policy, and public programming for urban linguistic diversity. He also teaches linguistics at Columbia. His writing has appeared in the New York Times, The Guardian, Harper's, and elsewhere. And his first book, Intern Nation, How to Earn Nothing and Learn Little in Brave New Economy, ignited a national conversation about unpaid work. And it is now my pleasure to introduce tonight's speakers.
I have to do this obnoxious thing where I have my phone here because we have a newborn at home, and my wife might text me that she had a big diaper blowout or something. So I'm not trying to not pay attention. Anyways, Ross, it's great to be here.
Likewise. Thanks for doing this, Jason. Thanks to the NYPL, to Allison and the whole team, and thanks to you guys for coming.
Yeah. So first of all, this book is fantastic. I hope everybody here buys it if you haven't already read it. But we were talking backstage. There's a few chapters where you highlight a few people throughout the city who speak some of the languages that you talk about in the book. And I was wondering if maybe there was a short section that you could, because it actually it's wonderful journalism. It's really some great stories in there. And I was wondering if maybe you can kind of give us just like a short.
So in some ways, the main character of the book is the city itself, and it doubles as both a linguistic history of New York City, the story of how this became the most linguistically diverse city in the history of the world, as we've been documenting it at the Endangered Language Alliance, and as I show in the book. It's also about the Endangered Language Alliance, this very strange kind of extended family of linguists and language activists and ordinary New Yorkers who are, engaged with trying to make this Babel work, such as it is. But then it's also, as Jason is saying, it's the story as well of 6 particular speakers from particular groups from different parts of the world. And it was not easy to choose sort of 6 speakers from the 700 plus languages that are here in the city, as far as we know, if not more. I'm sure there are others that we don't know about. But these 6 are all people that I've worked with closely for several years. They're people I know well and with whom, I thought that there were represented many different ways of trying to preserve, revitalize, and celebrate different endangered languages. So they come from totally different communities and different situations. I guess I can briefly maybe introduce each of them, and then I'll read a little about one of them. At the sort of vital center of the book in many ways is Lenape, the original language of this land. And I profile a woman named Karen who passed away before the book came out, unfortunately, but was really the first person to bring the language back to the city as a teacher. She is a member of one of the Lenape nations in Canada and would drive these hundreds of miles to come to our center on 18th Street and teach the language for what we think is the first time in several centuries here on Lenape land in what's now New York City. Karen has been doing this through teaching. Irwin, another one of the six, is a Nahuatl-speaking chef from near Puebla City in Mexico who cooks with Nahuatl, the language of the Aztecs, the language that gave us the name Mexico itself, with the etymologies of this language in mind, all the words that you can think of for Mexican cuisine, taco, guacamole, even chocolate, tomato. These are Nahuatl words, and Irwin is both a chef and a poet in his language. Husnia is a Wahi speaker from high mountain Tajikistan, who speaks really like a dozen different languages and has used a different language at every level of her life. Boris was the editor of the Yiddish newspaper The Forwards for 17 years and is trying to keep Yiddish going through literature and through poetry. And through his artistry and through the press, and then let's see. There's Ibrahima, who is keeping his language strong through technology in many ways, and that section focuses actually on a writing system called Unko, which unites a group of languages from West Africa called the Manding languages. And then finally, the section that I'll read is about Rasmina, a speaker of Seke, and I think I can just kind of introduce that through the section. A couple pages I'll read about her. This village has elevators. We step into one of them. More of our cousins and relatives live on this side, says Rasmina. One family is in 6F. Some cousins are on 5. An uncle just moved to 3K. Every floor, there's one of my aunts living in it, one of my relatives, someone from the village. We'll start on the 6th floor and come down to the 5th. We'll knock and see if anybody's home, just to say hello. She presses a button and the box lurches upward. This vertical village in the heart of Brooklyn is home to a significant percentage of the world's approximately 700 Seke speakers. All are originally from 5 villages in the Mustang region of northern Nepal, near Tibet. But over 100 live or have lived in this one building, 7,000 miles from home. Seke speakers call it 380 because of the address, and it's now the 6th Seke-speaking village. To gather critical mass in a neighborhood is hard. To carve out space in a single building, even harder. Forget the apart in apartment living. The city's vertical villages, which don't appear on any map, are intensely communal sites of cultural and linguistic survival. They upend urban theory. They develop a spatial and social logic all their own. They are also vulnerable. In a vertical village like 380, the future of a language is at stake. Like Trung, the language I researched in China, Seke belongs to the Tibeto-Burman language family, which includes Tibetan, Burmese, and ultimately all forms of Chinese, but also hundreds of smaller languages spoken across the Himalaya. For centuries, Seke speakers were under Tibetan political, economic, religious, and cultural influence. But Nepali, an Indo-European language closer to Hindi and ultimately English, started spreading up from the south around the 18th century. Today, Seke is squeezed from all sides. 2 of the 5 Seke-speaking villages are heavily represented here, Tsuksang and Tsangle, which almost count as one village, says Rasmina, because people tend to marry one another, as her Tsuksang father and Tsangle mother did. Everyone from these 2 villages is now said to be related through a dense weave of marriages. English kinship terms are vague to the point of uselessness when Seke speakers need to reference their uma, paternal aunt's husband, and at the same time utterly cold for not seeing cousins essentially as brothers and sisters. Likewise, ashang, uncle, or incha, aunt, can be used with anyone a generation older, za, son, or zeme, daughter, with anyone a generation younger. Today, half of Tsuksang and Tsangle seem to be in 380, especially working-age people with children. Except for elders and a handful of others, the original villages stand empty while the one in Brooklyn is full. Seke villages are small settlements of rammed earth houses jammed together and surrounded by fields and orchards on what little flat land there is. All around are enormous cliffs eroding into columns and facets in ever-changing shades of ochre and beige, pocked by ancient cave dwellings. It's desert at over 10,000 feet, parched and protected by the Himalayan rain shadow cast by snow-capped mountains twice as high at the edge of the frame. Through the middle runs the river that Seke speakers call Omdikyu, better known as Kaligandaki, which forms one of the world's deepest gorges while concealing in its banks beguiling shallograms, Cretaceous fossil stones, holy to Hindu pilgrims as symbols and incarnations of Lord Vishnu. Some work the land, raise animals, and run guest houses, but most young people now leave for New York. 380 is a 6-story brick building in Flatbush, built in 1960, of the kind found everywhere in the outer boroughs, because buildings up to 6 stories don't need a water tower under local law. Instead, there's just a flat, ordinary roof, technically off limits, of course, where smokers and teens look out to the Manhattan skyline at an almost tangible distance. 3 acres of space, packed into 6 floors, means 136 rental apartments, plus a small Pakistani mosque, a dentist's office, and a medical practice on the ground floor. 3, 4, or more people may share a 500 square foot apartment, splitting $1,500 a month in rent. No one remembers who came here first from Tsuksang or Tsangle, but for the last few decades, almost everyone has followed them. Word of any openings spreads quickly on the WeChat and WhatsApp groups that link Seke speakers in New York and beyond, with new arrivals just staying on the same lease, unbeknownst to super or landlord. Besides being relatively affordable and linguistically and culturally navigable, the building is near nanny and nail salon jobs for women and restaurant and grocery store jobs for men. There is reliability and safety, says Rasmina, because at the end of the day, if something goes wrong, your people are there. America is the ultimate goal for virtually all Seke speakers, believes Rasmina, and 380 is a foothold in America.
So I wanted to kind of ask you about, because this is the kind of book that initially when it was presented, like somebody told me about it, I was like, oh, is this going to be like an academic book? Because that could be a little boring. Sorry, no offense to academics. God bless you. You're doing the Lord's work. But I was just moved page after page. I always cringe a little when I use the term passion to describe writing, but there's this passion that you write with and this appreciation that just bleeds through. And it's really wonderful. And part of it I get is because you are a native New Yorker, and this is a very New York book. I was saying, not to blow smoke up your butt. It's to me, it's like one of those books like Lucy Sante's Slow Life, or any book you could read on like the Astors. It's one of those books that explains New York in a very specific, special way. So the New York thing I get, but what was your road to becoming a linguist? It's such a fascinating thing to me, and I think the crowd might like to know a little bit about that.
Well, luckily the book is not a memoir, so I don't torment readers with too much personal stuff, but there is a kind of fire underneath it. And I have sort of one foot in the academic world, and there's a little bit of linguistics 101, but it's, absolutely meant for a general reader, for New Yorkers, but also for people who just love languages, love cities, the intersection of the two. I grew up in the city, sort of fourth generation, you could say, with all my great-grandparents, as I say briefly at the beginning of the book, having come through Ellis Island all around the same time, all being multilingual, all having learned English kind of on the boat or as soon as they came over, and having Yiddish as a native language, but also speaking to different degrees Polish, Russian, and German. Though there was a sort of thinning out over time, and by the time it came to me, I was raised essentially monolingually in English, but surrounded by all these other languages in the city, not really realizing that I was living in what was becoming the most linguistically diverse city in the world, but just deeply curious about the languages all around me and trying to sort of explore them and inhale them, but not really understanding what this field of linguistics was all about. And it actually took being thousands of miles away, being in Beijing, as I describe in the book, and hearing a Chinese linguist named Sun Hongkai talking about global language loss and the fact that there are these 7,000 plus languages in the world, that as many as half of those languages are endangered, and that Professor Sun himself had spent 50 years, most of his life, trying to document those languages in China, as many languages as he could. That sort of blew this open for me, and I up to that point, I think, had thought, as I think, many inevitably do, that, okay, there are about 200 nations in the world. There's probably, one or a few languages per nation, something like that. And, that's it. I had no conception that there were thousands of languages of which the most endangered were the least documented, that there are, even today, that only about 5% of the world's languages are online, that there are several thousand languages for which we have essentially no documentation, no dictionary, no books in those languages or about those languages. And the reasons for that are all pretty complicated, and I try to introduce some of those issues in the book, but that started me on this path about 20 years ago of trying to become a linguist and to get involved in this new field of language documentation, which was growing up in response to this issue, and saying, well, we need to go out. Linguists have to work with communities to document these languages, and whether or not they'll continue to be spoken, of course, is up to the speakers and up to the community, but at the very least, there should be dictionaries, there should be records, there should be archives, there should be options and futures and choices for speakers. And I kind of went in the footsteps of Professor Sun to this part of Southwest China and was there for a number of years working on PhD and all of that. But came back to New York after that with kind of a different set of eyes, and saw actually that the city itself was this linguistic miracle. And this organization, the Endangered Language Alliance, had just been established by my co-director, Daniel Kaufman, as well as another linguist, a poet, and a whole group of New Yorkers from all these different backgrounds. That was in 2010. The first organization in the world kind of focused on the linguistic diversity of cities, and trying to sort of make something out of this, this linguistic miracle of New York. And I that's kind of where the book then begins.
And one thing that I'm constantly fascinated with is the New York accent, the classic New York, which there's different variations on it. You can go to the Bronx, you hear a different one. You go one street in Brooklyn, you hear it. At another street, it's a different one. And I was wondering, because it's like, when you start to understand, like, oh, there's a little bit of the old Irish, there's the little Yiddish, there's a little, it's a gumbo. When did that start developing? When did the New York accent we know, because it took from all these different languages, when did that actually become, when did that start to come into the...
I trace a little of this history in the book, although in a way the story of New York English is kind of the inverse of the story I tell of increasing linguistic diversity in the city. We're now in the sort of 400th anniversary of New York's colonial founding in 1624. It already starts out as a very linguistically distinct place in the earliest years. It's a Dutch colony, but it actually is the Dutch West India Company. It's not the nation of the Netherlands, so it's actually this commercial port where a reported 18 different languages were spoken by the first 400 inhabitants. And it was sort of immediately at the intersection of three continents, right? There were Native American languages here, not only Lenape, but others. There were the languages spoken by enslaved Africans from almost the very earliest period. And then there were the minority languages, largely of various European immigrants who were working for the company, who were not necessarily Dutch speakers. Dutch became a lingua franca, but Peter Stuyvesant was Frisian. Peter Minuit, who supposedly purchased Manhattan, was Walloon. These are minority groups of Europe with their own distinct languages. So it was a strange place from the very beginning compared to these more or less kind of English-only colonies like Massachusetts and Virginia in the earliest stage. And it's not clear exactly where New York English kind of emerges from the mists of time, but it's definitely built from the sort of layering of all of the different immigrant groups that came through, possibly based partly on the distinctive Englishes that were also brought from particular places in the British Isles as well. Certainly seems to be kind of emerging already by the early kind of mid-19th century. And at the same time is kind of not just one thing. New York English, and even sort of more than an accent, it's really its own kind of dialect with distinct set of words. There's also gesture. There's a whole set of things, and it also can be kind of decomposed into what linguists sometimes call ethnolects. and that there actually is sort of African American New York English, there's Latino New York English, there's Jewish New York English, and then actually Jewish English more broadly or Italian English more broadly draw on New York features because New York played such a key role in, as an immigration gateway for those groups. So the ongoing story of New York English. I mean, it's a story that is deeply tied in with immigration, and it also has a paradox in it, which is that for such a powerful and influential city, all in all, New York English has been very low prestige. This is not like Parisian French. This is, you would think like, oh, New York, New York English. This is the most powerful city. The English spoken here would be, but actually, it's been sort of heavily kind of demarcated on a class basis, where elite New Yorkers, well, they once to some extent spoke it. If you listen to FDR's kind of old
George
recordings.
Plimpton.
Yeah, George Plimpton.
Right.
But overall, it became something that elite New Yorkers did not want to speak, and so it was preserved more among working class New Yorkers, and then also among immigrant New Yorkers of those who were sort of shifting to English. So, as with my family, as with I think yours and many others, what immigrants often, newcomers to New York are often shifting to, because what they're hearing around them is actually New York English. Yeah. But then there's this immediate pressure to, if not other large languages like Spanish or Mandarin and so on, that they may actually first be, shifting towards when they come to New York, something we can talk about. But it's it's actually New York English is deeply associated with the kind of the story of the book and that the sort of the immigrant experience in many ways.
And one of the parts, and there's one that I found specifically fascinating because I don't want to say you demystify, but I feel like there are so many New York stories that you're just like, oh, this happened, and this was a time period, and here's the 5 figures from that period, and they're important. But there's so much more to all these things and all these times and people and places. And one of them that I loved was about the Harlem Renaissance. And you talk about Harlemese, which the African American, Afro-Caribbean influences. Can you explain a little bit more, like go into detail about that a little bit, like what exactly that entails? Because, I'm thinking about it. I'm like, oh, these are all these words that like, you watch some movie from like 1930 and it's like the hip jazz cats are using these terms and it influenced so much. And I never would have thought, oh, that's a Harlem thing. Can you...
So I think part of the story is also, the larger story of the book is New York as this capital of diasporas and intersecting and overlapping diasporas coming together and influencing each other. And there is this linguistic story that I think is not always told about the Harlem Renaissance, that this was actually, yes, heavily driven by this great migration of African Americans from the South, but also encountering in New York this large Afro-Caribbean and then later African migration as well that turned Harlem into this nerve center of the global African diaspora, something which is continuing even more so today, with Harlem and the Bronx being, the nerve center of the new African immigration to New York, especially West African immigration, and that this is actually the sort of cultural ferment that creates, as was noted by kind of famous figures like Zora Neale Hurston and James Weldon Johnson of the Harlem Renaissance at the time, who themselves, or Cab Calloway, became lexicographers, started collecting the terms and words that were being used and dubbing it Harlemese, this term for this sort of this distinct language which came about as a product of these intersecting forces of the African diaspora. And that in turn then, as so often with African American forms of English, then kind of spreads into, general usage.
And, there's another thing, one little, I was mentioning this backstage, but I have been using this little bit of trivia for like over a month now since I finished reading the book, but I did not realize that Lunar Park in Coney Island was just based off the Yiddish term Luna Park. There were just so many Jews hanging out down there, and I guess that's why they named it that, I assume.
Well, one thing I hope the book kind of does is give you a lot of trivia for, you know, various.
That's my very specific brand.
Yeah, there's a lot of, especially, you
My
know,
holidays
the
are coming up,
footnotes.
so-
I've tried to pack them in there. Check out the footnotes. But yeah, there's meant to be a lot of trivia that you can also just kind of pull out and you know, sort of hopefully shock people with.
Well, but you've what I was going to ask is you have like that, for instance, or any of those words from Harlem. Like we call everyone a hipster still. I don't know why. We got to stop using that. But like, you know, we go to the bodega. You know, it's like it's all of these. A lot of terms that New Yorkers use come from different. They come from groups that maybe are not their own. And we live in a time where I think, you know, we hear the term cultural appropriation a lot. And I'm wondering, with that in mind, like, do you think that it's still going to be a thing where you kind of hear everyday New Yorkers using terms from other groups, and it's like sort of the acceptable thing to do? Because I don't want to hear like some white guy like yell "bumbaclot." Like like just because you live in Crown Heights doesn't mean you could say that. Like, is that going to help like continue things by being able to sort of have that cross-cultural dialogue, or do you think it's going to wane?
I think the degree to which it's possible is an index in many ways of how integrated a city we are. And the more segregated we are, and of course there are, you know, all the flavors of segregation that have defined the city, but to the extent that we are integrated in certain spaces, whether it's the subway or the bodega or the school system, I think it becomes possible to have this kind of lexical sharing. And for words like bodega, or I would say one of the more recent ones that I talk about is ak, which is spreading among at least working class New Yorkers.
And TikTok.
And TikTok.
Oh my God, it's
huge.
huge.
Yeah, TikTok has played a role in the spread of ak. So ak is like the bodega guy. It's a word for the bodega guy that comes from Arabic originally. And so bodega itself, I mean, is a word whose kind of lexical tendrils I try to trace in a few pages of the book, because it's such a fascinating word that actually, you know, is related historically to, you know, words like apothecary that we might think of, or apteka, which in several languages means more of like a pharmacy, but also, you know, a whole bunch of words that have a whole bunch of meanings. But bodega in its New York usage as like the corner store specifically comes from Caribbean Spanish starting in the 1950s and 60s. And it's because you have, you know, so many Cuban, Puerto Rican, and Dominican owners of the corner stores. And, you know, I don't think nobody thinks that when you're using the word bodega, it's appropriation. Maybe when a startup tries to brand itself as bodega, they have an issue.
But they have an issue with the whole city.
Yeah, so I think it does. There is this, you know, this question of like who is a New Yorker, and to what extent the, you know, words become sort of markers of that identity. And another thing I talk about that's related to this are the mixed languages of New York. So. You know, this is an intense site of not just certain kinds of language preservation as well as language loss, which is what much of the book is talking about, that dynamic, but also language mixing that comes from how much New Yorkers themselves are mixing as well. So, you know, of course, we know this word Spanglish, but that is kind of is just this gigantic umbrella term for something that sounds very different in El Paso versus East LA versus the Bronx, right? But it's, you know, it's also something that varies deeply from person to person or interaction to interaction, and it's, you know, but there's also, you know, forms of Russian English mixing. The city is a major site for yeshivish, which is this particular kind of Orthodox English, Yiddish, Hebrew type of mixing. One that I focus on in the book is called Ramaluk, which is a type of language mixing that's happening in the Himalayan community, where Tibetan, Nepali, and English and other languages are all kind of in contact. So, you know, it's a product of language contact. It's a product of the fact that we are all kind of, to different degrees, interacting with one another, and you know, having these and it's also the musical and culinary sort of magic of the city too is very much based on mixing and contact. So I think, you know, to the extent that that's continuing, and that it's based on real interactions and real contact between, you know, neighbors and friends and, you know, all of that, then I think, you know, that cycle can continue. But if not, then I think it raises, you know, sharper issues of appropriation.
And, you know, with the city going in whatever, I don't even know what direction it's going in, you know, between gentrification and our genius mayor, Sorry if he's here. I don't think he is. I'm always kind of curious about the way language is going to evolve in the city, because I live on a block where right across the street from me it's a Jamaican guy who owns a garage. Right next to him is a loading dock where a bunch of Hasidic guys. I don't know what it is. It looks like they're just trying to make the biggest bowl of cholent in the entire world. It's always big bags of vegetables going in and out, and then a warehouse owned by Chinese guys. They're always talking, and some of the Hasidic guys know Chinese, and some of the Hasidic guys who also run the bakery across the street from them speak perfect Spanish. And the way it blends, I'm hearing it because I speak a little bit of Spanish and enough Yiddish to understand. But I'm kind of fascinated by this thing that I was kind of trying to get through in the book. If there's maybe a developing sort of new language coming out of New York that you've been seeing, or different, you mentioned like Spanglish, or you mentioned New York Italian. Are there any new languages, like hybrid languages on the horizon that might?
I have to see, depending on what groups are coming and who's kind of meeting. I mean, we're seeing, for all the different things that are happening in the city, immigration continues to be, the heart of it. It continues to be a defining aspect of who we are. And I ask the question towards the end of the book. The book is kind of organized around past, present, and future. So there's that linguistic history, and then the present is about the six speakers and kind of their life stories and what they're doing. And then the future section asks, is this peak diversity? What happens from here? How does a city operate with 700 plus languages? We've created and we're still, constantly updating a map of those 700 plus languages as well at over 1,200 different sites around the city, and actually including to some extent the suburbs and satellite cities, because the diversification of the suburbs and the diversity now in places like Newark or Yonkers or Portchester, outside the city is also now considerable. New York is is a test case and a paradigm case and the most extraordinary case in many ways. But as I talk about in the book, New York is not alone in this. It's a leading indicator, but cities everywhere are becoming more linguistically diverse. Paradoxically, just at the moment when more and more languages are being lost, and this is just because of urbanization, everybody is coming to cities, and of course, generally, cities don't support that kind of linguistic diversity, or they do just for a generation or two, and then that shift kind of kicks in because of all of the pressures, not least economic, but also political and social pressures. So, the question of whether this is peak diversity, what this sort of new hybrids that I talked about a little bit, what they mean, and whether they will stabilize or whether they themselves are transient phenomena. But one thing we've seen, obviously, in just the last couple of years is a new Venezuelan New York taking shape. We've seen Fulani and Wolof speaking New York growing hugely. With the so-called migrant crisis, we've seen the classic drawing power of New York and the way that ultimately it's immigrant communities themselves that are able to do the best work in terms of supporting new arrivals. In many ways, and that language is at the heart of these issues, and that to understand where people are coming from, you need to understand linguistically what's happening. It's as I say in the book, among the earliest settlers were speakers of Frisian and Flemish, and among the newest settlers are speakers of Fulani and Fujianese. And just to say that people are coming from Guinea or China or Mexico or wherever is to miss the point of the very specific paths that people are taking for specific reasons from particular communities, and those stories of migration and those links between New York and villages or regions on the other side of the world, which are even more deeply impacted in some ways than New York is. If you go back to those places, the new houses, the new developments, the new things that are happening in those places as a result of remittances and ties to New York. So I think what we're seeing is something that's happening more broadly around the world, the sort of increasing linguistic diversity of cities and even smaller towns. I think this is part of the horrible sort of tension with this invocation of Springfield, Ohio, and talking about the Haitian community there. Again, it's a sort of inability to deal with what New York has been trying to, has been all about for a long time, and now the rest of the world is also kind of seeing.
I mean, one of the things that I'm also really fascinated with, you talk a lot about indigenous languages of the Americas, and we had been I'd mentioned to you there used to be a bar, a very famous dive bar in Brooklyn called Hank's Saloon, and the history of that place was tied. I forgot which tribe.
The Mohawk Steelworkers.
Yeah, the Mohawk Steelworkers, which you talk a little bit about them in the book. And the fact that there have been so many indigenous American languages spoken in New York, and nobody really talks about that. That's really fascinating to me. I'm wondering, like something like that, does it just fade away? Is it gentrification makes, or what is it? Why do we not even talk about the fact that these languages are being spoken in New York?
I think it's not well known that New York has, according to the census, the largest native North American population, the largest Native American population in the country, larger than any other cities in the West or the Midwest that have much more, are closer to large reservations and have much more visible Native American populations. I think to some extent it's this idea that Native peoples and indigenous peoples are seen to be in general as kind of, on some distant reservation or on some distant mountain or distant island, and that people are not realizing that, urbanization is affecting everybody, and that actually, something like 70% of Native Americans live in cities. So, the story of the Mohawk Steelworkers deserves to be much better known. It's one of the extraordinary ones. Although what's really characteristic in some ways of Native American New York is its diversity. So according to the American Indian Community House, which is the largest, maybe oldest organization for Native American New Yorkers, there are, talking to the director a couple of years ago, something like 80 members of 80 different tribes who are part of the organization, as well as people who are not members of enrolled tribes as well. And yes, this includes people of Lenape background, but it also includes people from all over the country. And then you have on top of this what I describe in the chapter on Irwin, the Nahuatl poet and chef. You have this massive migration of indigenous language speakers from elsewhere in the Americas, including speakers of several dozen indigenous languages of Mexico, Mayan languages of Guatemala, and now, and especially within the last couple of years, speakers of different Quechua varieties from the Andes, with many coming from Ecuador just in recent years, speaking a bunch of different varieties of that language group. And yeah, the visibility is not necessarily there to outsiders. I mean, many of the communities that I talk about in the book are not really sort of seen by outsiders. But I think that has been part of the work and the impetus and the desire on the part of those communities to be part of the mapping process, to come, reach out to the Endangered Language Alliance, to get involved in language projects, to have their languages be in some form recognized by the city. These are primarily oral languages, I should say as well. The book is really often sort of talks about the fact that the vast majority of the world's languages have been traditionally oral. So we're often kind of looking for language in the wrong place if we're just looking for signage and looking for writing. I mean, part of the work in some cases is to write down the languages and develop literacy and teach it in that way. It's often something people want in this day and age for preservation and revitalization. But traditionally, most languages were oral, and that didn't mean that they were just dialects or broken or in any way inferior. Linguistically speaking, they could be and often were just as, if not more complicated than, various written languages. So, a lot of it is hard to see because it's not visible. It's oral.
Yeah, I forget what avenue it is or boulevard in Queens, but there's literally like 80 languages or something.
Roosevelt Avenue is
right.
If you take Roosevelt Avenue through Queens, I mean that's one way to. I mean
that's a pretty but it's a long. I mean But I was wondering because just for my own curiosity, because now I'm like is there a neighborhood that you could point to in the 5 boroughs that might be the most diverse in terms of?
I want to stir up the crowd.
Oh boy,
this could get violent.
Oh boy.
I live in Ridgewood, Queens, and I talk about there's this little section of the book called A Home in Queens, which kind of is a thinly disguised Ridgewood that talks about, even though it's not a place that is particularly kind of visible in this respect, that it actually has this sort of extraordinary everyday linguistic diversity to it, with languages especially from Southern and Eastern Europe, but also from South Asia, from Latin America as well. Certainly Jackson Heights stands out for many, with good reason. It's extraordinary as a microcosm of South Asian and Himalayan linguistic diversity, and then right next door, Corona, which is, has as much in terms of Latin American indigenous languages as you can find anywhere in the city. So that part of Queens, I mean, justly, I think Queens kind of can and I say this not just as a Queens resident, but I think Queens has a good claim here, and that part of Queens for sure. Although communities are always on the move, and it changes, and certainly it was Manhattan. Manhattan was a world of ethnic neighborhoods, and there certainly still is. Right this week, the United Nations is here reminding us that the United Nations itself is kind of just another city neighborhood, and that there's an extraordinary diversity there among elite New Yorkers too, which is a little different from kind of communities living together. But also I kind of argue against the enclave model, or the idea that there's little x, little y, little z. It's actually much more kind of complicated and to some extent integrated than that. And what you actually have are these microcosms. You have in some sense, a microcosm of West African linguistic diversity in Harlem and the Bronx. You have a microcosm of Chinese linguistic diversity in Flushing, a microcosm of the former Soviet Union in and around Brighton Beach in Brooklyn. And so, certainly if you look at, the areas where immigrant New Yorkers are settling, it tends to be, there's large sections of Queens, it's the whole southern half of Brooklyn, it's the northern part of Staten Island, it's a large section of the Bronx, which is becoming sort of ever more linguistically diverse. So the patterns are always changing, but they have their own sort of logics to them, and there's a constant kind of motion to the city's linguistic geography.
Yeah, it's so hard for me to argue against just anywhere. And if you say anywhere in Queens, Gesundheit. If you say anywhere in Queens, I'm like, yeah, that's probably right. There's a bakery I like. It's a kosher bakery, and it's like Bukharan Jews, I believe. And
Rochat?
No, it's King David. And they're like, oh, yeah, we have bread for us, and then we have bread for the Ashkenazi Jews, and we have bread for our Pakistani friends over there across the street. We make bread for the, like, every different ethnicity. I'm like, you just make all this bread. That's crazy. It's like the small world of bread. This is for me as a person who likes carbs. I mean, that's where we're all the same. We're all the same. We're all God's children who love carbs. But I was really, kind of like wrapping this up as we kind of take some questions from the audience. I'm wondering, like, what, we might not speak, everyone here, I don't know who speaks more than one or two languages. Well, we all speak one language, hopefully. But how can everyday people help to preserve these languages? What can we do? Get involved, learn a language, sell me on that. I would love, help me, because this stuff I think is actually very important.
Good segue. The books are available just outside. I think I'll be able to sign, and would love to chat with anybody.
We set that up perfectly.
Bart from the library as well. Yeah, I mean, certainly look at the Endangered Language Alliance and our activities, and get involved in whatever way. We're a small, scrappy, strange little nonprofit, but we've been going since 2010. We've got a little office on 18th Street. We're trying to do this work as I said, linguists and communities in collaboration, as well as ordinary New Yorkers. But I would say also, try to open your ears to the city and listen to it in this different way, and sort of make this a part of your lens of how you see the city. That the linguistic diversity is not just a sort of something that is kind of taken for granted or known in theory, but actually sort of made concrete in a way of relating to your neighbors in your neighborhood, sort of scratching that surface. Whenever I think somebody tells you in New York that oh, we speak Italian, or oh, we speak Chinese, or there's often a deeper story there, because it's a city of minorities, as I really argue in the book, and that actually those Italian speakers are in many cases often coming from a Sicilian or Neapolitan background. Those Chinese speakers are often coming from Toisanese or Fujianese or Shanghainese background, and that yes, these national languages are sort of more familiar to us and something that we can kind of see with, but actually the more interesting and deeper story is about these highly local identities which we bring with us, which we continue to carry with us, these sort of real sister cities on the other side of the world in some ways, and then the highly local identities that are developed here, and these sort of completely one-off combinations that you see, these hybrids that happen here, because a Bangla speaker takes over an old Sicilian bakery in Astoria, and creates a new, set of items that have never been seen anywhere before. So it's a lot of this very ordinary, everyday stuff that I think sort of gets us beyond just a sort of generalized picture of, oh, isn't it nice that there are things here from all over the world, to actually sort of relating at a level where then we feel engaged to fight for the future of the city.
I just want to wrap this up, and we'll take questions, but I want to wrap it up by just saying, with this book, I think you've done something really special, and that's as somebody who pays a lot of attention to food, both just looking at it and thinking about how much I want to eat it, but also thinking about like the history and where it comes from, and I think you've done something really special with this book that I think has been going on in the food world a little bit over the last decade or so, where it's like, let's be honest, you ask most Americans what they think Mexican food is, they'll be like, well, it's tacos, it's nachos, it's good, and then you realize there's like all these different kinds of Mexican food. There's all these different kinds of Chinese food. There hasn't been a book like this that I've read that does that with language, and you've just done such a beautiful job explaining that. And I mean, I'm going to walk outside in my neighborhood and listen to the Chinese guy and the Jamaican guy and the Hasidic guy in a different way because of this book. And I think it's a really special thing you've done, and I hope all of you buy it, because there's a lot of people here, it's very much worth reading. And
thank you.
Yeah, I wanted to say thank you, and we could take a few questions from the audience. I think there's somebody with a microphone. I'm not going to be the person who chooses. I don't like that.
Hi, thank you. Does your nonprofit have any programs for school children?
I have spoken at a number of schools in the past and had some discussions with the DOE. We've also spoken at colleges and high schools, but down to sort of third graders, second graders even, and it's certainly something we like to do, and I think it's an important thing. And actually, there's classrooms. The classrooms and schools in this city are among its most linguistically diverse spaces. So having a program. In terms of more dedicated programs, we don't have. It's not something that we've had the expertise or the funding for. But I think that we've been kind of consulted about this, what's been called a bilingual revolution that's happening in the schools. So with the establishment of more and more dual language schools, there are now programs in 13 different languages. People who are involved in those have asked us for feedback, but communities want to establish more, but no, so far beyond that, we have not been deeply engaged on that level, and hope that either we or others can be.
So first of all, thank you for writing this. It's extraordinary. I've read it. I did read the footnotes. I talked to everyone I knew when I was reading it, and to share different stories. One of my favorite anecdotes was the inadvertent role that that technology is playing in preserving languages. I think you talked about voice memos And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about the particular challenges of trying to preserve a language in which there's not a lot of literacy, if there's even a written form. You talked about it a little bit, but expand on that.
Thanks, thank you. Yeah, technology is not a, it's not a simple story. It's not that technologies are killing languages or saving languages. It depends on the technology, it depends on how it's used, and the more sort of oral often or orally oriented the technology is, maybe the more it actually can help. And a number of the languages that I talk about in the book are kind of languages of the telephone, where just the ability to, and now sort of easier than ever, since it's no longer the expensive calling cards, but there's actually kind of, cheap or free ways to be in contact. These things that we haven't, there's a number of speakers of languages in the city who are the only speaker of their language here. And so for their chance to use the language is to call a relative back home, thousands of miles away. And yeah, likewise, voice memos and, audio messages and WhatsApp groups and WeChat groups are actually key places for these languages. We talk about domains of use in terms of language endangerment, where, you could think of a maximal domain situation as one where, as with English, this lingua franca of the city, it's used everywhere, religious services, politics, business, everything. But that actually, as languages become more and more endangered, or if they're smaller to begin with, they're used really only in a few particular spaces, often in the privacy of one's own home. So they're not even going to be sort of audible in public spaces. And then even a further reduction really, is these situations where only technology is perhaps, giving a way for speakers who are isolated from one another to connect. So I'm trying to write something right now about sort of the impact of AI, the big expansion of Google Translate that just happened, the future of translation. This may be a next project. There's a lot going on, some of which is wonderful, some of which is sinister. It's a really kind of strange juncture that we're at.
Hello. First of all, we're neighbors. I live in Ridgewood too. So I wanted to ask a question about documentation, which kind of relates to the previous one. I wanted to ask, kind of in a nutshell, how do you go, what is the first step? What is step one, and how do you even document an endangered language? Are you recording? Are you doing grammar? Yeah, I'm just...
Thanks. Yeah, language documentation is this kind of strange subfield of linguistics which has its own art. And lexicography, the making of dictionaries, the writing of grammars, these are, very nerdy, but also kind of have their own sort of art to them. So I try to describe a little of this in the book, but could definitely say more. It's, you work your way through, this was the process when I was working on, my... there's a few languages that I've worked on kind of in more depth, Himalayan languages like Seke that I mentioned, but also one I talk about in the book that I worked on as part of my kind of PhD fieldwork. And you start often, trying to just figure out the sound system, right? This is like the first step, the sound system, the phonemes as they're called, the meaningful sounds that are actually sort of the building blocks of the sound system. That's often done through what are called minimal pairs, so collecting sort of pairs of words that differ in just one segment. So in English, I think I give the example, we know that, we have bat and pat are two different words. And so we know from that B and P, B and P are two different phonemes, two different sounds. This is sort of classic linguistics, but and that in turn is, those two sounds differ only in one respect, actually. That one is voiced with the vocal cords vibrating, and the other is unvoiced with the vocal cords not vibrating. B is the one that's vibrating. You can sort of put your fingers here and try it after. But so, you work your way through that. That can take a long time just to figure out, okay, what are the meaningful sounds? And then you're sort of building up from there, how are words structured and put together, which is called morphology, syntax, which is the whole sort of how are things ordered, and clauses and combinations. And then there's many different kind of areas, everything up to sort of gestures and kind of real world pragmatics and semantics, the nuances of meaning. So each of those domains, to really go into depth, takes a long time, and really relies on kind of these long-term collaborations between linguists and speakers. and a lot of recording as well, and archiving, and all of that as well.
It's my turn. Thank you so much. By the way, there was a little island performance, outdoor performance based on your book. Did you see it? And I want to ask your take on this performance. Also, for example, about yeshivish. Yeshivish is because I myself I went many years to yeshiva. I think it's more like jargon, because people just use different terms, for example, from Aramaic, because they study Talmud. And I wouldn't say that it's a kind of a new language. It's, for example, jargon. What do you think about jargon also? So I have kind of two questions for you.
Well, for the first, I was involved in the in the production that you mentioned, where the book was turned into a theater piece at Little Island just last month. So I have to say I liked it because I was very involved in it, and I wanted to see what it would be like to turn a piece of nonfiction of this nature into a performance. It's centered on, in this case, 4 different performers, and one of them, Irwin, is in the book, but the other 3 were other people that we've worked with who we thought it would be fun to sort of create a theater piece with, one of whom is a Pontic Greek musician in Astoria. So this is a particular group of Greek speakers from what's now Turkey, who have a large community here. One is a Tibetan singer, and another one is a storyteller from Sierra Leone who speaks in a language called Kuranko, and we made a whole kind of theater piece outdoors at Little Island, that new park, from this. I don't know whether it'll happen again, but it was an interesting experience to sort of make nonfiction theater about languages in all these languages with a lot of subtitling. It was with a lot of stuff from the book as well. The question of jargon is interesting. I mean, Yiddish itself, one of the languages that's featured here, was often dismissed by its own speakers as jargon, as some kind of jargon. And the word jargon itself has a history. And one thing I hope that the book kind of reflects is that every word has a history. And we haven't talked about it today, but the question of language versus dialect. And of course, in every language, there are different ways of talking about languages and dialects and all of these things, and there are different ways of sort of dividing it. So, language is a word with Latin roots, dialect is a word with Greek roots. They sort of got entangled with one another during the Renaissance and found their way into many European languages like English. But if you look at, even a language like Spanish, has a different way of dividing things up, and there's words lengua, lenguaje, idioma, and dialecto, which are used in different ways. In Mandarin, yuyan, fangyan, tuhua. These are 3 different categories that don't really map exactly onto, ideas of language and dialect, which, again, cannot really be, there's no sort of definitive universal definition of what a language is, and it's often very political how any given way of speaking is referred to. So jargon, I forget the exact history, but basically jargon is a word that has been used to dismiss ways of speaking and somehow indicate that it's not formal, not educated, broken, transient, temporary. And so that's why it was applied to Yiddish. Oh, this is just jargon. And originally that was people who were not Yiddish speakers, but then speakers themselves come to sort of internalize language shame, as I talk about in the book, and sort of say, oh, well, what we speak, it's just a jargon. So I think that word is often a charged word, and the ways we talk about how people speak are often charged in this way. But still, the question with Yeshivish, I think, is kind of about all of these hybrids that perhaps you're asking: is it stable? Is it going to be passed on to the next generation? Does it look and walk and talk like other languages? And that is a more complicated question, because if it's only used in the particular setting of a yeshiva, or if it's only used by a portion of a community, if it's not passed on to the next generation, and if it's not looked upon, as a proper kind of mother tongue for a community, then it may always have a kind of lower or transient status. But nonetheless, certainly from a linguistic point of view, we can analyze the ways that Yiddish, Hebrew, Aramaic, and English are being mixed. And there are sort of structures and patterns to it. And it's, in that sense, functioning very much as, human communication that can be understood and has regularities and nuances like any other.
I think we have time for one more, and he's had his hand up for a while.
I was just wondering because you talk about a lot how like none of these languages in New York are kind of really in isolation. I was just wondering how that affects like your efforts to conserve these, and it's like how does it affect those efforts?
Yeah. So there's many forms of language contact that are happening, as I mentioned, as I said, traditionally cities have not been great places to preserve languages, to pass on languages. The pressures are, if anything, kind of more enormous. You're far from the homeland of the language. A lot of the things that you're used to talking about in the language, a lot of its kind of power and its coordinates are gone in the city. But I think what we see and what I talk about in the book is that there are also new kinds of opportunities that happen in the city, and that people are wanting to record themselves, speaking their language in Times Square, having sort of new words that they bring in, and these new sorts of hybrids. So, I think it's, as I said, it's always up to the communities and to speakers themselves whether they're going to continue speaking. What linguists can bring to it is, that ability to document, that ability to sort of present options, possible futures, tools, and in that sense, the city also there's a lot of possibilities because unlike these sort of relationships where you're working with a community maybe thousands of miles away, you're visiting, you're parachuting in, or it's there's a strong kind of outsider-insider dynamic in many cases. When people are working as neighbors more, and there's just an office kind of a subway ride away, and where people are kind of in these kind of long-term relationships, there are possibilities of documenting languages and of doing sort of different projects, putting languages on stage, having drawing on all the resources of the city that people are being drawn to, why they're here in the first place. So a lot of certain kinds of things are possible, certain kinds of things are not, and you just have to sort of recognize those limitations and see what can be sort of made. I mean, we're in an unprecedented experiment. We're living, it feels very ordinary in many ways, but it's an unprecedented thing for 700 plus languages to be in the same city in this kind of way. So I think we're just beginning to kind of realize what we have and where we are and see what the possibilities are.
I think that's it. Ross, thank you so much.
Thanks to Jason. Thanks to you guys. I'm gonna hang out a little bit to those who had further questions, and of course pick up a book. Happy to sign. Happy to hang out. But thanks again for coming, and thanks to the library.